Hey, it's Tim here. Thanks for traveling with me. Today we are going on a walk through the Glaciers National Park in southern Argentina, Argentinian Patagonia, to see some of the most spectacular mountains that this country has to offer.
Hey everyone,
I'm Tim, and I've just finished a 9-month odyssey around Latin America. Now I'm reopening my diaries, and this time I'm bringing you along with me. Week by week, country by country, all the colors, all the craziness, all the food, all the music, and all the splendor. 9 months when each morning was a new adventure. The road was my companion, and Latin America cast its spell on me. This is my Latin America Diaries.
Welcome back to Latin America Diaries. I woke up in the town of Ancud in the far north of the island of Chiloé and headed out bright and early straight for Puerto Montt Airport, the nearest major airport in the region. From here, I would be flying south to Puerto Natales, the gateway to Patagonia. Now, visiting Patagonia was something that I had been debating in the lead up to my trip to South America. On the one hand, it is expensive, remote, and logistically challenging, but on the other hand, it is an integral part of the continent, and so obviously a visit to Latin America would be incomplete without visiting Patagonia. So I decided that I would set myself a limited time frame to spend in Patagonia, and I would try and work my budget around that. So I boarded a LATAM flight and headed south. From the moment I landed in Puerto Natales, it was clear that this is no ordinary destination. The airport sits out on this vast open plain surrounded by mountains that don't look like the Andes that I'd seen before. These weren't lush or dramatic in the usual sense. They were stark, steel grey, gunmetal blue, almost lifeless. And the landscape felt exposed, like there was nothing between you and the elements. From the airport, I took a shuttle bus which dropped me directly to the Puma House Hostel in the center of town. Puerto Natales is not a very big town, but it's incredibly well set up for visitors to Patagonia. I had booked a tour in the days leading up to my visit there with a website called De Nomades, and they contract a local company called Patagonia Planet to take groups on budget-friendly trips out into the Torres del Paine National Park. This, for most travelers, is the main reason to visit Puerto Natales and Patagonia in general. For most travelers, they try to get really deep into the park to follow one of two hikes. There's one called the W hike and another one called the O hike, both so named because of the shape that they trace out on a map of Torres del Paine National Park. These hikes are considered some of the most spectacular hikes in the world. However, they also include certain logistical challenges and, you need camping gear. They also require fees to stay overnight in the park and several days in the park. And that didn't really fit within my budget. And this was kind of where the compromise was, that I was going to see these things, but that I would need to see them on a day trip. You can self-drive into the Torres del Paine National Park if you have your own vehicle while you're there. However, I decided to go for a tour because the weather in this region is very fickle and I was really there for the photography, and I sort of only had one day in which to see as much spectacular scenery as possible, and I felt that a tour would be much better at anticipating the weather patterns and organizing that for us. So I went with the tour. The next morning I was picked up before sunrise. We drove out of Puerto Natales in darkness, through mist and cold air, heading deeper into Patagonia. The sun rises late here, and for a while everything felt muted and grey. Our first stop was at the outpost of Cerro Castillo, which offered a small roadside souvenir shop and a cafe. Nothing really fancy, but they had coffee, so absolutely essential. And as well as that, we got to see this dog who was very happily taking up an entire sofa to himself. From there, it wasn't long before we reached the entrance to Torres del Paine National Park. Quick tip, as far as I can remember, none of the tours into Torres Torres del Paine National Park actually include the national park entry ticket, so that's normally factored into your budget separately to the cost of the tour. As we drove into the park, there was a bit of tension. Clouds were hanging low, and in a place like this, that can mean missing everything. But then, slowly, the mist began to lift, and Torres del Paine began to reveal itself. And just in time, the clouds parted enough for us to catch our first glimpse of the Torres del Paine, the three iconic granite towers that give the park its name. And yes, they are just as dramatic as everyone says. Three jagged peaks like blades of stone thrusting straight up into the sky. They're harsh and angular, almost unreal against the soft rolling landscape around them. It's the kind of sight that makes you stop mid-sentence. This is Patagonia. We got out of the bus and the guide told us that we'd have a bit of time to do some photography by the road, but that we needed to keep moving because there were other parts of the park which were perhaps even more spectacular. Our next stop was the waterfall, a powerful cascade fed by these glacial waters, right at the base of the surrounding mountains. As we stood there, something incredible happened. The sunlight hit the spray from the waterfall just right, and a perfect rainbow formed in the mist. And that was the moment where we really began to discover the color palette of Patagonia, because you begin to notice it everywhere. The almost unreal baby blue sky, the gunmetal grey rock, the powder white snow dusting the peaks, the electric turquoise of the rivers and lakes, and those muted tones of beige, khaki, and olive in the vegetation. It's a landscape that feels painted, as if every color has been dialed up just slightly beyond reality. From there, we continued even deeper into the park, stopping at a viewpoint that overlooks the wider mountain range that cuts through this part of Torres del Paine National Park. Clouds were still moving quickly overhead, threatening to roll back in at any moment. Our next major stop was at Salto Chico and the Mirador Cuernos, and this is where you begin to see the park from an entirely different angle. Here, the focus shifts away from the Torres and onto the Cuernos del Paine, the Horns of Paine. These are dramatic in their own way. They're dark rock jutting upwards into the sky, layered on top of slightly lighter granite down below. And beneath all of this, there is a gushing cascade that tumbles down from the mountain directly before the lookout. But when we arrived, we couldn't see much at all. The mist had come back, thick and heavy, swallowing the peaks entirely. So we started walking back towards the car park, thinking that that might be it. And then, just like that, everything changed. The mist began to lift. Slowly at first, and then all at once. The Cuernos del Paine revealed themselves, towering above us, emerging through the cloud like something being created in real time. It genuinely felt cinematic, like watching the landscape being forged in front of you, these massive, jagged forms rising out of the mist as if they hadn't been there a moment before. In Patagonia, you have to work with the weather. In fact, the weather doesn't quite ruin the experience, it is the experience. Beyond that, we continued heading south on the road back towards Puerto Natales, and it was around here somewhere that the driver pulled off the road for a moment for us to behold the stunning lookout over Lake Pehoé. And this lookout basically affords you some of the most incredible panoramic views in all of Torres del Paine National Park. Not of the famous towers, but of the entire landscape. This is where you can really take in the scale of Patagonia. And from here you can see the Cuernos del Paine rising dramatically above the lake. It looked like something out of a fantasy novel. You know, if you imagine like kingdoms in the clouds and castles floating through the sky. I mean, this was it, but for real. I still can't quite believe that I witnessed it. It was sublime. There are no words for scenery like this. I was just standing there completely gobsmacked, watching the mist drift across the lake and the clouds trail through the mountains. Later that day, and we were all pretty tired by this point, we arrived at the service center for Grey Lake. From there, we didn't hike far, but we did get the chance to walk out toward the lake and experience a little bit more of the wilderness up close. And while much of the landscape here can feel harsh, cold, windswept, and rugged, there's also a quiet beauty to it. Even in autumn, with the muted tones and the chill in the air, it was stunning. On the way back towards Puerto Natales that afternoon, we stopped in at the Mylodon Cave. Now this is a really fascinating place. It's not just a cave, it's an archaeological site where the remains of a prehistoric animal known as the Mylodon were discovered. The Mylodon was a giant ground sloth that lived here thousands of years ago. And while there's no solid evidence that humans and Mylodons directly interacted, early human presence has been found in the area, so they may have coexisted. Eventually, as the light began to fade, and it does get dark pretty early down here, we made our way back to Puerto Natales. I was looking for a budget dinner, so I had another completo. Again, not the healthiest, but well within the budget, and I only had to survive like this for a week. If you're enjoying what you're seeing, please consider giving the video a like and subscribe to my channel to be notified whenever I upload new videos from this series. And if you really like what you're seeing, please consider telling your family and friends about it. It really helps me grow my YouTube channel. The next morning I woke up and headed to the bus station in Puerto Natales, from where I caught a bus across the border into Argentina, bound for the town of El Calafate. The drive itself was beautiful, empty roads, soft morning light, and that vast Patagonian emptiness stretching out in every direction. Now, El Calafate is a place that I'd been hearing about ever since I'd first arrived in Argentina months earlier. So it's kind of like a popular winter or alpine retreat, and it's kind of well-to-do, and it's kind of a place to see and be seen. So I naturally arrived with my backpack. I had met an Italian traveler on the bus. He was also backpacking, and so we decided to split the cost of an Uber into the center of town from the bus station, and I checked into the interestingly named Bla guest house. It was a slightly odd setup. It felt a bit like a converted kindergarten, but the staff were friendly and a simple breakfast was included, so I was happy. That afternoon, I took a wander around the town of El Calafate, and that's where it really hit me that autumn had arrived. The colors here were incredible. Reds, golds, burnt oranges, the kind of autumn that feels almost exaggerated. I walked down to the edge of Lake Argentino and watched the sunset, and when the leaves are that color, golden hour really is golden. So by now, this was day 3 of 7 in Patagonia, and I had planned for the next morning, day 4, to head out on a day trip towards El Chaltén, which is another small town on the edge of another national park and home to the famous Mount Fitz Roy range. And yes, you could absolutely make the argument that the scenery here in El Chaltén and Mount Fitz Roy is very similar to that in Torres del Paine, although in El Chaltén and at Mount Fitz Roy you need to walk more for it, whereas in Torres del Paine it's much more accessible. However, I mean, what was I going to do? Spend another day just walking around El Calafate? No. I decided to make the most of the time that I had there and the budget that I had, and within that budget would be a day trip towards El Chaltén. It's a 4-hour bus journey from El Calafate to El Chaltén, and El Chaltén is really a small service town. There's not a whole lot to do here in terms of the town itself. It sits right on the edge of the Los Glaciares National Park and serves as the gateway to some of Patagonia's most famous hikes. This area really comes into its own if you stay in El Chaltén and you can catch the Mount Fitz Roy range at sunrise or sunset. However, I was seeing it on the fly. From the town, you can actually see Mount Fitz Roy. However, you can get a much better view if you climb up to the Mirador Los Condores, which is the Condor lookout. I reached the top just as the clouds were starting to roll in, wrapping themselves around the peak of Mount Fitz Roy. If I went back to El Chaltén for a second visit, I'd probably try and spend a bit longer and do one of the hikes into the national parks, even possibly an overnight hike, because I really think that this kind of place, it really rewards sort of time invested in those sorts of visits out to remote high altitude lakes and lookouts. But still, I did have a pretty good time there. I got back down into the town of El Chaltén to find that the electricity had been switched off for the entire town and was due back in an hour or two. So I just kind of milled around looking for a coffee. I don't think I had time to do another hike while I was there, so instead I just waited around the bus station for a bus which would take me back towards El Calafate. The next morning, day 5 in Patagonia, I had yet another early start, and this time to the place that really put El Calafate on the tourist map. That's the Perito Moreno Glacier. It lies within the Los Glaciares National Park and spills down from the Andes near the Chilean border into Lake Argentino, and it is immense. I've seen glaciers before, I've seen them up close. In fact, in Pakistan, I even walked on a glacier. But this is different. Maybe it was the scale, maybe it was the color, maybe it was the fact that it crashes directly into a lake. But standing there, looking at it, it felt kind of prehistoric. The face of the glacier looks like it's been sliced clean through. Towering walls of ice, jagged, fractured, and glowing in that incredible, almost unreal blue. I was a little bit worried that the color wouldn't be there because I had been told by someone that the color really is sort of like it emerges in the sunshine and is accentuated by the reflection of the blue sky above. But even in the rain, even in the cold, it was that blue and it was that spectacular. Chunks of ice were floating in the water below, some crystal clear, some streaked with rock and sediment from their journey down the mountain. And then, while I was standing there, I heard it, a deep cracking sound. At first I wasn't really sure what it was, but then it became clear that a section of the glacier was about to calve. I got my camera out and pointed the lens towards the face of the glacier and waited. And then this happened. There are options to take a boat closer to the glacier, but I decided to stay on land, and I don't feel like I missed out on that much. By that point, it was absolutely freezing, and I decided that I'd seen what I had come to see, so I jumped on the shuttle back towards El Calafate. Now, El Calafate, it's an interesting name because it's actually named after the Calafate berry, which is native to this region. It's used in jams, in different desserts, in sauces, and even in cocktails. And there's even a legend which says that if you eat a Calafate berry in Patagonia, that you are destined to return one day. So I set out to search for the local cocktail Calafate sour, which is sort of like a local take on the pisco sour, but strangely I couldn't find it being served anywhere. The next morning, day 6, I jumped on the bus again and headed back towards Chile. It was an early morning bus that took me across the border to Puerto Natales, where I had a couple of hours to wait before catching another bus even further south to Punta Arenas. Punta Arenas is a larger, more established city, but it still feels very much like the end of the world. In fact, while I was there, I checked into the hostel El Fin del Mundo, which literally means the end of the world hostel. And when I arrived in Punta Arenas, there was a bit of a quiet atmosphere. I mean, of course it was cold and late, but I also realized that the flags outside of the Punta Arenas main cathedral were at half-mast, both Chilean and Vatican flags, marking the passing of the Pope. I was walking around downtown looking for a cheap dinner, which I found, and then I stumbled across a small bar that was serving Calafate sour. And with that, I raised a glass to the end of my Patagonian journey. 6 days on a budget across 2 countries and through some of the most spectacular scenery that I've ever seen in my life, and that is certainly not overstating things. The colors, the scale, the wilderness, the wildness of it all. I mean, these are the sorts of things that really just stay with you. And they're the kind of thing that really pushed Chile up into the top 4 of my favorite Latin American countries that I visited. I stayed the night that evening in Punta Arenas, and then the next morning flew back up towards the center of Chile to meet some friends, and that's coming up next time on Latin America Diaries. So when I crossed over the border that morning from El Calafate on my way back to Puerto Natales, it was actually me leaving Argentina for the last time on this trip. And Argentina is a country that I had been into and out of 4 times over the prior 2 months. So now that it's time to finally leave Argentina behind on this trip, I think it's time for a rapid fire round. To begin with, favorite city in Argentina? No doubt Mendoza. I just loved it there, sitting in wineries in a Mediterranean climate, right in the shadow of the Andes. I mean, how could you not love that? It's a proper city too, not just a small town, and it had just such a relaxed, warm, inviting vibe. Favorite region is Patagonia. That was just spectacular. I mean, El Calafate was awesome. The Perito Moreno Glacier right there. I'd actually love to get under the skin of Patagonia a lot more, so I'll need to come back another time with probably more time and a bigger budget. And maybe head further north in Argentinian Patagonia to Bariloche that I've heard a lot about. Favorite food would have to be asado. I mean, I had it everywhere, but I guess it was most memorable in Buenos Aires. And also, like an honorable mention, it would have to be for the Malbec wine in Mendoza. Those winery lunches are something else. And then best experience, that would probably have to be Iguazu Falls. For me, and I think a lot of people, Iguazu Falls is really tied to a trip to Brazil because the largest airport in that region is in Brazil. So often you arrive in Brazil first. And although I did approach Iguazu Falls on the Brazilian side to begin with, it was the Argentinian side that really had me emotional about it. So, I mean, hands down, Iguazu Falls was the best experience of my time in Argentina. And just like that, that is the end of my time in Argentina. So thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because next week I will be heading back to the central region of Chile.